Little Richard was exhausted from the religious conflicts he'd experienced in the 1980s, but when he saw himself as a young man in Prince, he found new energy. Prince would be Richard's heir not just musically but in terms of identity, makeup, high heels, sexual ambiguity and stage dominance. Richard's first advice to Prince was clear: "I tried to do this in the 1950s and they crucified me. You're doing it in the 1980s and they're applauding you. But don't make my mistake, never apologize for who you are." Prince took this lesson so seriously that throughout his career, he never gave up his androgynous identity. The bond between these two legends wasn't just musical but spiritual, and when Prince died, Little Richard would cry saying, "I lost a son." Make sure to subscribe to keep following this story and not miss similar content. Now let's dive into the depths of this 31-year mentorship between two androgynous legends. 1978, Prince's first discovery of Little Richard. In 1978, when Prince Rogers Nelson was only 20 years old, he had an epiphany while listening to Little Richard's old recordings at a small record store in Minneapolis. He'd listened to James Brown, Sly Stone and Jimi Hendrix up to that point, but Little Richard's 1950s recordings affected him in a completely different way. Prince told friends that day, "I figured out what I want to do. I want to be like Little Richard, but I want to go further." Little Richard's falsetto voice, piano virtuosity, and most importantly his androgynous stage presence would form the foundation of Prince's future identity. At that time, Prince's musical identity hadn't yet crystallized, and he was trying different styles. But something changed after he discovered Little Richard. Prince realized that androgynous identity could be not just a stage performance but a lifestyle. In the 1950s, Richard wore makeup, dressed in women's clothing, and kept his sexual identity ambiguous. Prince thought this could be done again in the late 1970s and could even go further, but he hadn't met Little Richard yet, and he'd have to wait 7 more years to reach his mentor. From 1978 to 1984, while Prince was building his career, he integrated Little Richard's style into his own music. The sexual openness in the Dirty Mind album, the gender-bending approach in the Controversy album, and the androgynous costumes during the Purple Rain period were all inspired by Little Richard's 1950s revolution. Music critics were noticing this similarity and describing Prince as the new Little Richard, but Prince wasn't acknowledging it yet because he wanted to prove his own identity. 1984, Purple Rain and the Year of Recognition. In 1984, the Purple Rain film and album made Prince an international superstar. He was now a recognized figure, not just in music circles but in mainstream culture. This success gave Prince confidence but also created a new problem. While everyone was telling him he was original, Prince knew how much he'd been influenced by Little Richard, and this situation bothered him. On one hand, he wanted to enjoy his own success. On the other, he felt indebted to his mentor. Little Richard, meanwhile, was watching Prince's rise from afar in 1984 and experiencing complex emotions. On one hand, he was proud that Prince was continuing the androgynous style. On the other, he was thinking that he'd never received the praise Prince was getting. Richard had done the same things in the 1950s but had been labeled a pervert. Prince was doing the same things in the 1980s and being celebrated as a genius. This generational difference both made Richard happy and hurt him. When a music magazine asked Little Richard about Prince at the end of 1984, Richard's answer was diplomatic. "Prince is a talented musician, I respect him." But what he told friends was more honest. "This kid is doing what I did and getting applause. When I did it, they put me in church." These words showed the contradiction inside Richard. He wanted Prince to succeed, but he also remembered his own trauma. 1985, First Meeting and Paisley Park Encounter. In the spring of 1985, Prince's manager pulled off a complete surprise. He invited Little Richard to Minneapolis and introduced him to Prince at Paisley Park Studios. This meeting was the realization of a childhood dream for Prince because he was finally face to face with the man he'd admired for 7 years. Little Richard, however, saw this meeting differently, an opportunity to mentor a young artist so he wouldn't experience the trauma Richard had lived through. At their first meeting, Prince was nervous and didn't know what to say to Little Richard. Richard, to put Prince at ease, started like this: "You're doing what I did, but you're doing it better. I tried to do this in the 1950s and they crucified me. You're doing it in the 1980s and they're applauding you." These words relaxed Prince and the ice between them broke. Then Richard added, But don't make my mistake, never apologize for who you are. This first meeting lasted 3 hours, and the two musicians had deep conversations about androgynous identity, the music industry, and sexual ambiguity. Richard told Prince about the trauma he experienced in the 1950s, how he went back and forth between the pulpit and the stage, how he was forced to apologize for his androgynous identity, and how this destroyed him. As Prince listened to these stories, he couldn't hold back his tears because what Richard had experienced was Prince's biggest fear, being punished for being himself. The most important advice Richard gave Prince that day was this: times have changed, you're lucky, but remember this, even if society accepts you, the voice inside you will blame you. When that voice comes, silence it. I listened to that voice and it ruined my life. Prince took this lesson so seriously that throughout his career he never gave up his androgynous identity and never apologized. This attitude became Richard's greatest legacy. 1986–1990, regular communication and spiritual bond. After the first meeting in 1985, little Richard and Prince started having regular phone conversations. These conversations weren't just about music, they included the psychological pressure that androgynous identity brought, the media constantly asking about sexual orientation, and dealing with society's expectations. Richard was giving Prince advice from his own experiences, while Prince was keeping Richard informed about the current music world. When Prince released the Sign o' the Times album in 1987, the first person he let listen to it was little Richard. After Richard listened to the album, he told Prince, "You're doing what I couldn't do. You're combining music with androgynous identity, but you're not apologizing for it." This approval was very important to Prince because he wanted to make his mentor proud. That day, Prince thanked Richard, saying, "If you hadn't paved the way, I couldn't have walked this path." When Prince learned in 1988 that little Richard was in financial difficulty, he offered financial support, but Richard refused. "I'm not here for your money. I'm here to see your success," he said. This behavior showed that the relationship between the two musicians was spiritual, not just material. Prince respected this refusal but still looked for ways to meet Richard's needs. In 1990, when Prince was filming Graffiti Bridge, he invited little Richard for a cameo role. Richard accepted and played himself in the film. This scene was symbolic. The old generation was passing the torch to the new generation. The scene in the film where Prince and Richard took the stage together became one of the important moments in music history because two androgynous legends were meeting in the same frame. Lessons on dealing with identity crisis. In the early 1990s, Prince started struggling with his own identity crisis. His contract with Warner Bros. Was suffocating him and restricting his artistic freedom. When he changed his name to a symbol in 1993, nobody understood it, but little Richard did. Richard called Prince and said, "You're my 1957 self. You're trying to escape, but you can't escape. You can only transform." During this period, Richard gave Prince one of his most important lessons. "I went back and forth between the stage and the pulpit because I wasn't at peace with myself. Now you're going back and forth between Prince and symbol, but understand this, they're both you. You don't have to choose one." This advice deeply affected Prince, and in the mid-1990s he started integrating his identity. When Prince released the Emancipation album in 1996, he dedicated it to little Richard. In the album notes he wrote, "Thanks to Richard Penniman for teaching me to be free." When Richard heard this dedication, he cried because the mentorship he'd done was finally being recognized. But he replied to Prince, "You were already free, I just reminded you." By the late 1990s, little Richard started having health problems and Prince visited him regularly. These visits were very important for both musicians because now the roles had reversed. Prince was taking care of Richard, but the conversations were still about the same topics: androgynous identity, social pressure, and the power of music. 2000–2010, the aging mentor and rising student. In the 2000s, little Richard started becoming increasingly isolated, but his connection with Prince never broke. Prince regularly called Richard and asked, "How are you? Do you need anything?" Richard usually answered, "I'm fine, I just wanted to hear your voice." These simple conversations were lifelines for both musicians. When little Richard introduced Prince at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2004, his speech was unforgettable. "This young man did what I couldn't do. He never apologized, never backed down, never stopped being himself. I'm proud of him." When Prince heard these words, he got on stage, hugged Richard, and said, "I'm your student." This moment was one of the rare times when the relationship between two legends was publicly reflected. Michael Jackson's death in 2009 deeply affected both musicians. Little Richard called Prince and said, "You be careful too, this industry is trying to kill us." Prince took this warning seriously but wouldn't be careful enough. Richard's fears would come true 7 years later. When Prince released the 2010 album in 2010, he sent a special copy to Little Richard and wrote a note saying, "I'm still using your lessons." Richard listened to the album and told Prince, "You're not a student anymore, you're a master." This change showed that the relationship between the two musicians had matured. 2011-2016, final years and growing concern. Starting in 2011, changes began to appear in Prince's behavior. He was living more isolated, and it was obvious he was suffering pain during concerts. Little Richard noticed these changes and got worried. He started calling Prince more often, but Prince answered, "I'm fine, don't worry." Richard didn't believe him but couldn't push. In 2014, Prince unexpectedly visited Little Richard at Paisley Park. This visit was emotional for both because Richard's health was deteriorating, and both knew this might be one of their last visits. That day, Prince asked Richard, "How can I thank you?" Richard said, "Don't thank me, just be happy." But Prince didn't look happy. In 2015, rumors that Prince was using painkillers reached Richard's ears. Richard called Prince and warned, "These drugs are dangerous, be careful." Prince said, "I'm only using them for pain, it's under control." But his voice was worried. After this conversation, Richard reportedly told those close to him, "Prince is in trouble but doesn't want help." In April 2016, Prince's health problems started hitting the media. Little Richard's worry reached its peak, and he started calling Prince every day. But reaching Prince was getting harder. On the morning of April 21, 2016, Richard tried to call Prince one last time but got no answer. That afternoon, when the news came that Prince had died, Richard's first words were, "No, I couldn't save him." 2016, Prince's death and Richard's devastation. When Prince Rogers Nelson was found dead at his home in Paisley Park on April 2016, Little Richard learned this news from television. The reaction he had at that moment was never forgotten by those around him. Richard looked at the screen and said, "I lost a son," and started crying. These words weren't just a metaphor. Richard really saw Prince as a son, and this loss deeply shook him. When Prince's cause of death was announced as a fentanyl overdose, Little Richard's guilt increased even more. "I should have saved him. My warnings weren't enough." He was blaming himself. Those close to him were trying to console Richard, but Richard was saying, "I went through the same path. I could have guided him, but I couldn't." This guilt shadowed Richard's final years. Prince's funeral was kept private and only close ones could attend, but a special invitation was sent to Little Richard. Richard didn't give a speech at the funeral but stood at the casket for a long time. Witnesses say they heard Richard whisper, "I'm sorry, son, I couldn't protect you." This moment showed how deep Richard's connection to Prince was. After the funeral, Little Richard made a statement to the media, "Prince was my continuation. He did what I couldn't do. He never apologized, and I'm proud of that." But life is hard for androgynous artists. Even if society accepts us, the war inside us doesn't end. Prince lost this war. These words weren't just about Prince but also explaining Richard's own trauma. 2016-2020, Richard's final years and Prince's shadow. After Prince's death, Little Richard's health deteriorated rapidly. Those close to him said this condition was spiritual, not physical. Richard was suffering from the pain of losing Prince. In 2017, Richard said in an interview, "After Prince died, I lost the meaning of my life because he was the continuation of my legacy." During this period, he constantly talked about Prince and repeated, "I wish I could have protected him better." Friends observed that Richard blamed himself for Prince's death and was therefore falling into depression. In 2019, Little Richard talked about Prince in his last public interview. "He was my greatest success. I gave music, but he gave me meaning. He never hid his androgynous identity, never apologized. I couldn't do that in the 1950s, but he did it in the 2000s. That was enough for me." These words showed Richard's gratitude to Prince. The hidden struggles. What Richard taught Prince about survival. What most people don't understand about the Richard-Prince relationship is that it went far beyond music and performance. Little Richard was teaching Prince survival strategies for living as an androgynous black artist in a world that wanted to categorize, control, and ultimately destroy anything that didn't fit neatly into boxes. These weren't formal lessons but conversations that happened during late-night phone calls, backstage moments, and quiet afternoons at Paisley Park when the world wasn't watching. One of Richard's most important lessons was about the difference between performance and identity. "When I was young, I thought the makeup and the clothes were just for the stage," Richard told Prince during one of their 1987 conversations. "The stage didn't make me feminine. I was always feminine. The stage just gave me permission to show it." This revelation helped Prince understand that his androgyny wasn't an act, it was his authentic self. Richard taught him that the moment you start treating your identity as a costume you can take off, you've already lost the battle. Richard also warned Prince about the church. Having spent decades cycling between secular performance and religious ministry, Richard knew intimately how religious institutions could weaponize guilt against queer and androgynous individuals. "They'll tell you God made you wrong," Richard would say. "They'll tell you your sexuality is a sin, your femininity is an abomination. But God doesn't make mistakes, baby, they do." Prince, who had his own complex relationship with religion, took these warnings seriously. Unlike Richard, Prince never fully retreated into religious fundamentalism, though he flirted with it throughout his life. The economic lessons: don't let them steal your legacy. Little Richard's most painful regret wasn't about his identity struggles. It was about the money he'd lost. The tutti-frutti contracts that left him with almost nothing while white artists made millions from his innovations haunted him for decades. He made sure Prince understood the business side of music in ways Richard never had when he was young. "Own your masters," Richard would repeat like a mantra during their conversations in the early 1990s. "I lost everything because I didn't own my music. You can't let that happen." This advice directly influenced Prince's famous battle with Warner Bros. In the 1990s. When Prince wrote "slave" on his face and changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol, he was fighting the same battle Richard had lost 40 years earlier. Richard supported this fight publicly and privately, even though many in the industry thought Prince was crazy. The financial devastation Richard experienced taught Prince to be strategic about his art and business. While Richard had signed away his rights for pennies, Prince negotiated some of the most artist-friendly contracts in music history. When Prince achieved full ownership of his master recordings in the 2000s, the first person he called was Little Richard. "I did it," Prince said. "I own everything." Richard reportedly cried on the phone saying, "You did what I couldn't do, you're free." The psychological toll. Living in the in-between. Perhaps Richard's most valuable teaching was about the psychological cost of living as an androgynous person in a binary world. Richard had spent decades being told he was too feminine to be a man and too masculine to be a woman. He existed in a psychological no-man's land that society couldn't categorize, and this ambiguity had taken a severe toll on his mental health. Richard was honest with Prince about his breakdowns, his periods of depression, and the times he'd wanted to give up. "There were days I looked in the mirror and didn't know who I was looking at," Richard confessed. "Was I Richard Penniman, the preacher's son from Macon? Was I Little Richard, the rock and roll screamer? Was I something in between? That not knowing almost killed me." Prince appreciated this honesty because he was experiencing similar struggles. The constant questions about his sexuality from the media, the speculation about whether he was gay or straight, the fascination with his androgyny, it all created a pressure that few people understood. Richard was one of the few who truly got it because he'd lived it for decades longer. "Let them wonder," Richard would tell Prince. "Your ambiguity is your power. The moment you give them a label, you give them control." This advice helped Prince develop his famous media strategy of never directly answering questions about his sexuality or identity. He kept people guessing, kept himself mysterious, and maintained control over his narrative in ways Richard never could in the 1950s. This was perhaps Richard's greatest gift to Prince, the wisdom that ambiguity could be a strength rather than a weakness. The warning signs Prince didn't heed. In the years leading up to Prince's death, Little Richard saw warning signs that reminded him of his own darkest periods. Prince was becoming increasingly isolated, surrounding himself with yes-men, and reportedly dealing with chronic pain that was affecting his performances. Richard had been through similar periods: the drug use in the 1970s, the isolation, the physical toll of decades of performing in heels and doing splits on stage. Richard tried to warn Prince about the dangers of isolation. "I made the mistake of pushing everyone away," Richard told Prince during a 2015 phone call. "When you're alone with your pain, that's when the demons win." But Prince, like Richard decades before, thought he could handle it alone. The painkiller addiction that eventually killed Prince was the kind of slow death Richard had narrowly escaped in his own life. The tragedy is that Richard had the roadmap for survival. He'd lived through the addiction, the isolation, the physical breakdown, but Prince either couldn't or wouldn't follow it. "I gave him the answers," Richard would say after Prince's death, "but you can't force someone to save themselves. They have to want it." This realization haunted Richard's final years, the knowledge that he'd survived the same demons that ultimately took Prince. The cultural impact, how their relationship changed music. The Richard-Prince mentorship didn't just affect these two men, it fundamentally altered how androgynous artists were perceived and treated in the music industry. Before Prince, the industry saw Richard as an anomaly, a one-off weirdo who'd somehow stumbled into success. Prince proved that Richard wasn't an anomaly. He was a pioneer of a whole tradition of gender-fluid performance that would only grow stronger over time. Artists like Janelle Monáe, Lil Nas X, and Frank Ocean have all cited both Richard and Prince as influences, creating a direct lineage from the 1950s to today. The freedom these modern artists have to experiment with gender presentation wouldn't exist without Richard opening the door and Prince kicking it wide open. Every time Harry Styles wears a dress on a magazine cover or Billy Porter shows up to an awards show in a gown, they're walking the path Richard and Prince paved. Conclusion: the shared legacy continues. The 31-year mentor-student relationship between Little Richard and Prince wasn't just a musical but an identity legacy transfer. Richard was the first black artist to bring androgynous identity to the stage in the 1950s, but he paid a heavy price for it. Prince followed the same path in the 1980s, but by learning Richard's lessons he never apologized and never backed down. This difference was the most important connection between the two legends. Richard opened the path, Prince widened it. When we look at Prince and Little Richard today, we see the evolution of androgynous identity in music history. Without Richard's courage in the 1950s, there wouldn't have been Prince's freedom in the 1980s. And without Prince's success in the 2000s, androgynous artists today wouldn't be so accepted. This generational transfer between two legends is important not just for music, but also for LGBTQ+ rights and social acceptance history. Little Richard's advice to Prince to never apologize for who you are has become a manifesto for all androgynous and queer artists today. This advice was accepted not just as stage performance but as life philosophy. The trauma Richard experienced in the 1950s became lessons so Prince wouldn't experience them in the 1980s, and these lessons still remain valid today. Perhaps the most tragic thing was Richard thinking he couldn't save Prince. But the truth is Richard had already saved Prince by giving him the courage to be himself. Prince's death in 2016 may have been physical, but the identity legacy Richard gave him is still alive. When Little Richard died 4 years later in 2020, at age 87, he took with him the living memory of what it cost to be the first, but he also left behind proof that the cost was worth it. A world where androgynous artists could exist, thrive, and be celebrated rather than crucified. The final image is poignant. Two legends, both gone now, but their conversation continuing through every artist who dares to be themselves. Richard taught Prince to never apologize. Prince lived that lesson, and now countless artists live it too. That's not a tragedy. That's a triumph.